A freight train is rolling toward a sleeping town. There is no one on board. No engineer, no brakeman, no hand on the controls. 72 tank cars, each one filled with crude oil, are picking up speed in the dark. In the town below, it is a warm Friday night, and the bar on Frontenac Street is full. Nobody in Lac-Mégantic knows that the last 90 seconds of their downtown have already begun. Lac-Mégantic is a community of about 6,000 people, nestled in Quebec's eastern townships. For generations, life here has belonged to the water. The town wraps around the damp, reflective edge of the lake that shares its name, a place where historic brick storefronts line the gentle slope of Frontenac Street. On a typical summer evening, this is the center of everything. Families walk along the lakeside promenade, patio lights flicker in the dusk, and neighbors catch up over drinks. By late evening on July 5, 2013, the social life of the town centers on the Musée Café. It is a popular bar and restaurant, and tonight its outdoor terrace is packed with people enjoying live music. For over a century, the railway has been woven into the town's geography. The steel tracks run directly through the middle of the downtown, just meters from the shops, the library, and the crowded tables of the Musée Café. Freight trains are a familiar, rhythmic presence, an economic lifeline that the town grew up around. People here are used to the rumble of passing boxcars. It is simply the background noise of life in the townships, a normal, unremarkable part of a quiet summer night. The train parked on the hill above the town that night was carrying a product that did not exist in such quantities just a decade earlier. Beginning in the mid-2000s, the Bakken shale boom in North Dakota flooded the North American market with millions of barrels of light, volatile crude oil. The continent's pipeline network could not keep up. The oil had to move by rail, bypassing safety regulations that failed to expand at the same breakneck speed. This particular shipment began its transit in Newtown, North Dakota, destined for a massive refinery in St. John, New Brunswick. It was a long route, sliced across Canada's regional rail networks. To reach the coast, the oil had to pass through the tracks of the Montreal, Maine, and Atlantic Railway, a struggling short-line operator. Purchased in 2002 by Railworld, a holding company led by Edward Burkhart, the railway operated under intense financial pressure. Burkhart's management philosophy prioritized aggressive cost-cutting. To squeeze profits from thin margins, the company deferred track maintenance, routinely parked loaded hazardous trains on active main lines, and pioneered the use of single-person crews. Operating a 72-car oil train with only one crew member was highly unusual, but MMA secured government approval to do so. It was a fragile operation, running on the absolute limit of what was legally permissible. That night, the cargo sitting behind 56-year-old engineer Thomas Harding consisted of 72 Class 111 tank cars, buffered by a single boxcar. Each tank car carried approximately 100,000 liters of light crude oil pumped from the Bakken shale fields of North Dakota, a total payload of nearly 7.7 million liters. The Class 111 cars were the cheap, ubiquitous workhorses of the oil boom, but regulators already knew their thin steel shells easily punctured and ruptured during derailments. The paperwork classified the cargo as a lower-risk packing Group 3 substance, but the Bakken crude was highly volatile, carrying an ignition risk closer to gasoline than standard heavy oil. At 10:50 p.m., Harding brought the train to a stop at the Nantes siding, 7 miles uphill from Lac-Mégantic. The tracks at Nantes sat on a 1.2% descending grade, sloping directly toward the commercial heart of the town below. Rather than parking the loaded hazardous train in a secure yard, standard company practice dictated leaving it right on the active main line. Harding, operating as the sole crew member, was scheduled to spend the night at a local motel before a replacement engineer arrived in the morning. He shut down the secondary engines, stepped out into the dark, and began the securement sequence. The heavy volatile consist sat idling on the hill, held in place on the slope only by its complex system of brakes. To secure a train of this size on a downward slope, rail safety rules required a specific test. The concept was simple. The physical handbrakes had to be strong enough to hold the entire weight of the train on their own, without any help from the locomotives. Train brakes operate on two separate systems. Air brakes use compressed air pumped from the running locomotive to push the brake pads against the wheels. Handbrakes are mechanical. To set them, an operator must physically walk along the gravel path beside the tracks, turning a heavy iron wheel on the side of individual cars to manually tighten a metal chain. Under Canadian rail rules, an engineer securing an unattended train must perform a test to prove these handbrakes alone can hold the weight. The engineer is supposed to set the handbrakes and then temporarily release the air brakes. If the train remains completely still, it is secure. If it begins to roll, more handbrakes must be turned. That night, Harding set only 7 handbrakes on the 5 locomotives and 2 of the tank cars. Then, he conducted the test. But he made a fundamental error. When he checked the hold of the manual brakes, he left the independent air brakes on the locomotives fully applied. With the air system still pushing the brake pads tight, the train did not budge. The test appeared to be a success, but the 7 handbrakes were not actually holding the 10,000-ton load. The invisible force of the air brakes was doing the work. The lead locomotive, General Electric number 5017, had been running rough and spitting thick black and white smoke all evening. The engineer reported the mechanical trouble to the Bangor controller, but they agreed to leave the engine idling overnight. It was a standard choice, but it carried a hidden dependency. A running engine powered the air compressor, and that compressor was the only thing keeping the air brakes charged. Shortly after the engineer checked into his motel, a local resident spotted flames shooting from the idling locomotive's exhaust stack. At 11:40 p.m., the Nantes Volunteer Fire Department arrived at the dark siding. Following telephone instructions from a railway employee, the firefighters shut off the fuel supply and flipped the main electrical breakers to extinguish the blaze. The fire was out, but the locomotive was now silent. With the engine shut down, the air compressor stopped. The automatic air brake system on a train relies on a constant pressurized supply of air to keep the heavy brake pads clamped against the steel wheels. Without the compressor running, the system began to lose its charge. Over the next hour, air slowly leaked from the reservoirs, escaping into the quiet night. The pressure dropped. Pound by pound, the pneumatic force holding the 10,000-ton train slipped away. The 7 handbrakes were now the only line of defense against gravity on the 1.2% grade. At 12:56 a.m., the physical balance tipped. The 7 handbrakes manually tightened on the locomotives, and 2 adjacent cars were not enough to hold 10,000 tons on a 1.2% descent. Slowly, the heavy steel wheels began to turn. The train rolled into the dark in complete silence. Because the lead engine was dead, the headlamps were dark, and the cabin was empty. No engineer was at the controls to apply the emergency brakes. No automated alarm flagged the movement to the regional rail controller. For 7 miles, the track sloped steadily toward the lake. The 72 loaded tank cars gathered momentum, rolling through the quiet woods of the eastern townships. Gravity acted as an invisible driver, accelerating the unlit, unmanned convoy faster with every foot of track. By the time the train reached the outer edge of Lac-Mégantic, it was hurtling. The massive consist had accelerated to 65 miles per hour. Directly ahead, in the commercial heart of the town, lay the sharp curve at Frontenac Street, designed for speeds of only 10 miles per hour. At 1:15 a.m., the runaway train struck the curve at Frontenac Street. The steel tracks, rated for 10 miles per hour, instantly gave way under the 65-mile-per-hour impact. 63 Class 111 tank cars derailed, pile-driving into one another in a crushing heap in the center of the town. Their thin steel shells, known for puncture vulnerabilities and high-energy impacts, tore open. Approximately 6 million liters of highly volatile Bakken crude oil spilled out and ignited in a massive explosion. A wall of fire rose hundreds of feet into the night air. Rivers of burning oil flooded down the sloping streets, entering sewers and drains, carrying the fire into the surrounding neighborhood and destroying roughly half of the downtown core. The derailment happened directly beside the Musée Café. On that warm summer night, the popular bar was filled with people enjoying live music, with dozens sitting outside on the terrace. The wall of fire engulfed the building and its patrons in seconds. There was no warning. There was no time to escape. 47 people lost their lives. Over 30 buildings in the commercial district were entirely destroyed by the flames. Because the crude oil soaked into the soil and the lakefront, almost all of the remaining downtown structures had to be systematically demolished in the months that followed, permanently erasing the historic heart of the community. By morning, the heat of the ruins forced the immediate evacuation of 2,000 residents, a third of the town's population. Firefighters from across Quebec and the state of Maine arrived to confront a fire that would burn for 36 hours. They faced more than flames. Approximately 100,000 liters of spilled crude oil had already migrated into Megantic Lake and the Chaudière River. The toxic plume carried downstream, threatening municipal drinking water sources for miles. On the ground, responders met an invisible, airborne hazard. The volatile Bakken crude released massive quantities of benzene, a known carcinogen, into the summer air. Monitors detected benzene spikes up to 650 parts per billion. To prevent acute poisoning, command officers forced responders to wear full-face respirators and work in brief, tightly controlled shifts. Fresh crews rotated into the hot zone continuously to limit individual exposure to the fumes. In the smoldering core of the town, the air itself had become a hazard, and the black oil was already traveling north toward the St. Lawrence River. The Transportation Safety Board of Canada spent months reconstructing the wreckage in the center of the town to understand how a parked train could destroy a community. Their final report, designated R13D054, did not lay the blame on a single worker or an isolated operational error. Instead, investigators identified 18 distinct contributing factors that formed a systemic failure. The physical chain began with the brakes. Only 7 manual handbrakes were set on a 10,000-ton train, and the engineer's test of their holding power was invalid because the locomotive's independent air brakes remained pressurized during the check. This error was compounded by the poor mechanical state of locomotive 5017, which caught fire and was subsequently shut down by emergency responders, cutting the compressor and the air supply. But the TSB looked past these immediate physical triggers to examine the organization itself. They found a railway operating with single-person crews, a practice that stripped away redundant layers of safety. Montreal, Maine, and Atlantic possessed a weak safety culture, which was paired with ineffective oversight from Transport Canada. The regulator had failed to audit the company's safety practices. The crude oil had also been routinely mislabeled as a low-hazard liquid, while decades of warnings about the fragile DOT-111 tank cars went completely unaddressed. It was a total breakdown of the system. In 2014, the legal aftermath began. Canadian prosecutors charged engineer Thomas Harding, rail traffic controller Richard Labrie, and operations manager Jean Demestre with 47 counts of criminal negligence causing death. After a lengthy trial in 2017, A Sherbrooke Superior Court jury acquitted all 3 frontline employees. Culpability, the defense argued, and the verdict reflected, lay with corporate policies and organizational gaps rather than individual actions. Edward Burkhart, the railworld chairman who ordered the company's aggressive cost-cutting measures, was never criminally charged. By the time of the trial, Montreal, Maine, and Atlantic Railway had already dissolved. The company filed for bankruptcy protection in August 2013, just weeks after the derailment. A court-approved restructuring later established a $460 million compensation fund for the victims' families, funded by insurers, governments, and industry partners. The disaster forced immediate, reactive changes to the rules of rail safety. Transport Canada banned leaving dangerous goods trains unattended on main tracks, restricted single-person crews for hazardous shipments, and mandated the phase out of the vulnerable DOT 111 tank cars. To protect the community from future runaways, the federal government approved a 12.5-kilometer rail bypass. Expected to open in late 2026, the new tracks will permanently route oil shipments away from the rebuilt downtown of Lac-Mégantic. No more oil trains would cross Frontenac Street. Today, the rebuilt streets of Lac-Mégantic look peaceful beside the lake. But across North America, thousands of heavy oil trains still roll directly through the heart of our communities. The systemic gaps exposed here remain largely unplugged. The tragedy wasn't a historical anomaly. It was a warning we still choose to ignore. Join the conversation in the comments below.